Fists hammered the door until the peephole throbbed. A laser dot skated across the wood. Porch light washed two men in unmarked jackets, radios clipped, eyes too busy for a neighborly visit. The clock slid past midnight. My phone was already recording. The door shuddered again. They said compliance. Their clipboard said emergency. The seal looked wrong, like it came from the wrong city on a tired printer. I spoke the time and address so the record would have bones. I texted one word to Rowan. He stepped from the hallway, plate carrier snug, helmet secure. He checked the peephole and set his palm on the knob without turning it. Outside, a radio crackled breech and tried to sound brave. Porch light brightened. One face flinched. The other shifted and the clipboard slipped, papers fanning over the mat. The top page carried a crest that didn't belong to our city. I unlatched the chain. Rowan filled the frame and spoke in codes and penalties, the steady tone of someone who has seen worse doors. A curtain moved 2 houses down. Another porch light woke. The tall man backed half a step and shed a layer of confidence. He claimed entry was authorized. Rowan asked who signed. The answer stumbled. The second man whispered into his mic. A red light winked on a device in his hand, and my Wi-Fi hiccuped. Rowan shifted to our hardwired line and kept the record alive. If you want homes safe from fake authority, press like so this reaches others, comment midnight if you are still with me, and subscribe for the resolution we are recording in real time. Back to the door because the night kept moving. The clipboard lay open, page stamp paid for services not yet rendered. The fence my father built creaked in the wind like an elder ready to testify. Rowan asked again for a signature. Threat floated thin. The camera held steady. Metal clinked at the back gate. Through the side glass, 2 more men leaned over the hinge, bolt cutters biting, chain links whitening with strain. I called out the time for the record. Training settled over the yard from Rowan. He nodded toward the gate, then toward the street, mapping lines I could not see. He wanted proof, not heroics. I stepped onto the porch with the phone held high like a lantern. The titles on their jackets meant nothing in any bylaw. Rowan shifted a fraction to say not tonight. The tall one swallowed and reached for the clipboard. A second letterhead flashed beneath, a name the board would rather not read aloud. Across the street, a sash eased open and a hand with a phone appeared. We were not alone. Sirens threaded the air from far away, thin at first, then tighter. The men at the gate kept cutting. The lock sparked once. Rowan's eyes met mine to say breathe. The tall man tried one more bluff and lost his courage. He promised to return stronger. Rowan answered with code numbers and patience. From the side yard, the sound changed as the lock surrendered a fraction and steel sang. Sirens grew louder. Cutters set their teeth again. I stepped back so the lens could hold both the porch and the gate, both the lie and the truth closing in. Someone was about to choose retreat or ruin, and our street would remember. Bolt cutters rose for one last bite, and the first patrol light slid around the corner. Next, morning remade the night into evidence. The clipboard from the porch lay open on the kitchen table under clean daylight, paper fibers sharp, ink a touch too gray. The seal on the top page carried a bird our city never used, and the motto in the wrong line weighed, as if someone had dragged a logo off a brochure and hoped no one would notice. The font in the header fought with the body text. The signature box was a rectangle with no name beneath it. The page wanted authority and had none. Ephraim arrived with a canvas folder that smelled like old basements and ink. He slid a laminated reference sheet beside the clipboard and tapped the real seal. He traced differences with a pen cap, the curve of the wing, the spacing in the wreath, the tiny yet inside the state outline that belonged to the contractor association, not the city. He had filed enough permits to recognize the species of a forgery at a glance. He wrote the report number on a sticky note and set it where the camera could see. Lena rolled up with her drone case and a quiet look that said she had something rare. We hunched over her tablet as midday flat light gave us a blessing. Behind the clubhouse, the yard baked and shadows sharpened, perfect for a clean capture. Deke stood with his jacket off, sweat printing a dark map between his shoulders. Karen faced him in a beige blazer, 55 plus, short white hair catching the sun like frost. He slipped a small envelope into her hand. She passed him a brass master key on a short tag. The timestamp matched the afternoon before the midnight knock. In the far corner, a gardener turned away, pretending to be invisible. The video held steady as any truth deserves. Sidewalks have their own kind of courtroom. We met Karen by the entrance sign where roses climbed the brick. She called last night a routine compliance check, voice light, smile warmer than the air. Her pen clicked and then went still when Rowan mentioned the word breach from the audio. She kept smiling, but the skin at her temples stiffened. The drone angle on the tablet waited like a witness with perfect memory. She tried to pivot to fines to say that noncompliance forces action. She made a point about rules being the backbone of community. Rowan nodded at the idea of backbones and asked for the policy authorizing midnight entries by private contractors. She assured us it existed. Ephraim said if it existed, the city had denied it last year in writing. A neighbor watered a lawn and pretended not to listen, the hose arcing small rain that caught the sun. A patrol car rolled by slow and friendly. The officer stepped out, took the clipboard, photographed each page, and asked for copies of the drone video and the door camera footage. The officer's notebook recorded the word impersonation with a careful hand. Karen stood a pace back, chin lifted, saying she welcomed transparency. Her eyes cut once to the tablet that held her exchange with Deke, then returned to neutral. My phone buzzed with a message from Vic, the treasurer. A spreadsheet screenshot appeared for a second, line items labeled night operations and door pressure, amounts neatly rounded, then the message vanished with an unsend, only a gray notice left behind. I had already captured the screen. The weight of it settled in my pocket like a small metal truth. Ephraim flipped through his folder and produced a letter from the city attorney dated last month refusing after-hours enforcement by non-sworn agents. He laid it flat so the officer could photograph the stamp. He spoke soft, almost tired, about people who push boundaries and make neighbors feel small. The officer nodded and logged another note, a steady line across the page. Rowan turned the brass key Lena had filmed into his palm, reading the tag number, comparing it to the inventory list Ephraim remembered from a maintenance bid. Service doors, he said, records, storage, pump room. We walked the sidewalk to the clubhouse in open daylight, camera running, steps slow enough to let anyone watching understand that nothing was being hidden. At the back of the building, a plain metal door waited under a small awning. The frosted pane beside it showed a vague shape of shelves behind glass. Rowan lifted the key to the cylinder and paused long enough to look at me, a question without sound. The officer nodded to proceed only to the point of confirmation. The key slid in like it belonged. A gentle turn, and the deadbolt shifted with a quiet, expensive click. The breath of the room seemed to move behind the door, a paper smell pressing forward. We did not open it. Not without a witnessed audit and an inventory. Rowan stepped back, thumbed the key free, and photographed the tag against the lock face. Ephraim wrote the time and door location on another sticky and patted it into the frame as if sealing the moment in place. Somewhere inside, a faint vibration hummed and went still, the kind of noise a phone makes when a message arrives and no one claims it. The officer lifted an eyebrow. We all heard it. Karen rounded the corner just as the sound died, hair bright in the sun, expression carefully arranged. Rowan pocketed the key. The door settled back into silence that did not feel empty. We walked away to file the request for a supervised entry. The day looked ordinary, but the lock had already told the truth, and the truth had just started to speak. The supervised entry felt like stepping into a mouth that had been whispering all night. Daylight filled the hallway. The officer read the time, read the door label, and nodded once. Rowan slid the brass key in, and the lock turned without argument. The room breathed paper and stale air, 1,000 small decisions stacked into boxes that tried to look boring. Shelves lined the walls in metal rows. Banker boxes wore names like years. Our street lived there in cardboard, each lot number penciled on with a supervisor's hand. The officer lifted a clipboard and began an inventory aloud. Ephraim stood close enough to smell dust and ink, eyes mapping categories like an old surveyor reading the ground. The first box with my lot number should not have existed. Its date sticker predated my closing by months. Inside, violation drafts waited with no signatures, photographs of my fence from angles that require a ladder, and a pre-filled invoice that assumed non-payment. Ephraim pressed a finger to the corner and said the photographs were taken before I owned the property. The officer marked a note that sounded heavier than ink. Rowan opened a drawer in a steel cabinet. A plastic sleeve rattled. Inside, a stack of notices matching the bogus emergency order, but here the seal had been cropped and resized until it lost its shape. He laid the sleeve flat and took a slow breath. He unhooked his dog tags and set them on the cabinet, a quiet promise to finish this clean. Metal on metal made a small, steady sound that anchored the room. Ephraim tugged a folder marked variance fee fence. He unfolded a handwritten letter from the prior owner. The words were careful and proud. The fee had been refused because it had no basis in code. A reply from the board demanded payment anyway and threatened a lien. A week later, the prior owner filed a change of address. The folder ended in blank paper. The officer put a paperclip on the edge so it could not vanish back into blandness. Vic arrived pale, carrying a spiral notebook he should have burned but did not. He looked at the boxes and failed to find a safe spot on the floor to fix his gaze. He said the board needed revenue to cover maintenance overages. He said private patrols started as eyes on the street and turned into something else after dark. He said he did not sign for break-ins, only for observations that could become fines. He pressed the notebook against his chest like a shield. Numbers bled through the paper. Ephraim slid printouts across the table, emails from the city that contradicted half the citations issued this year. He tapped the dates. The city had suspended enforcement on a disputed standard. Fines kept arriving anyway. The officer photographed each email and wrote fraud with a flat hand. A noise from the cabinet interrupted the silence, small and urgent, like a grasshopper trapped in metal. A burner phone rattled against a stack of folders. The officer looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at the officer. Both looked at me. No one touched it until the officer gloved up and brought it into the light. The screen flashed a notification from an unfamiliar name with a plain instruction. Tonight, seize the shed, remove cameras. Another message stacked on the first before any of us could speak. Use back gate. Avoid cul-de-sac. We did not cheer the confirmation. No one smiled. The officer added the phone to an evidence bag and read the messages into the record. Rowan lifted his tags back to his neck. The room shifted a degree toward clarity. Karen arrived at the doorway, clean blazer, short white hair in place, voice bright from the threshold as if this were a routine review. She stepped inside, saw the open boxes, saw the phone in the bag, and adjusted her tone without moving her face. She asked whether the records would be handled with care. Ephraim answered that care began when the first notice was written honestly. The officer asked her to wait outside until called. She drifted back into the hall, and the smell of paper regained its balance. Lena texted from across the street that neighbors were gathering on lawns. The story had leaked like sunlight. Rowan asked the officer to note that community eyes were now present. The officer nodded and continued the inventory. We found a binder labeled security partners with glossy contracts that used language soft as pillows to explain hard actions. Rowan pointed at a clause naming after-hours presence to ensure compliance through visible engagement. Ephraim said visible engagement was not a legal term. The officer muttered attempted coercion into the record. Vic's notebook finally left his hands and landed on the table. He turned to a page where night operations were billed by incident, each entry followed by a citation number issued within 24 hours. His fingers stopped on a bundle labeled door pressure. The dates aligned with the prior owner's departure. He stared at the numbers until they blurred, and then he said he was done carrying this. The officer collected the notebook, the binder, the forged seals, the letters from the city, and the photographs taken before ownership. He signed the chain of custody and asked that we lock the room pending a full audit. Rowan turned the key, the same smooth motion as the morning, only now it felt like sealing a wound. We stepped into daylight with evidence in our hands and a plan that would either bring air into the neighborhood or blow the rod into the open. A patrol idled by the curb. Neighbors watched from shaded porches. The sun made everything look simple. The messages in the evidence bag made sure it would not be. Tonight had been written in advance, and we had the page. The day sank toward evening but never lost its light. Rowan and I worked without rush, moving like people who had hours when we had only minutes. The shed in the back corner of my yard sat quiet, locked with a heavy pad my father had hung there. It held nothing more dangerous than tools and paint, but it had become the target on the burner phone's instructions. We treated it as if the lock guarded the truth. Rowan positioned the new cameras low, hidden in the shrubs, their lenses shielded from glare. The decoy cameras stayed mounted high on the eaves where anyone scouting would see them first. I ran a hardwired mic through a buried conduit, its cable covered in mulch. Our Wi-Fi could be cut. The line in the ground could not. Lena had her drone ready, its battery full, its camera sharper than most security systems. She climbed to the edge of the neighbor's roof for a better signal and set it to hover high above the yard. Through her tablet, we could see the grid of the block, cars parked at angles, the clubhouse roof catching gold from the low sun. The air was still, waiting. The first sign was not sound, but the flicker of a shadow across the fence line. Two men came into view from the far corner, moving in a crouch along the hedges. One carried a black device with short antennas, the LEDs blinking in slow rhythm. The other held bolt cutters with the blades already open. Their jackets were the same as the ones at the door 2 nights ago. No patches, no names, just a corporate blankness that meant they could vanish without a trail. Rowan tapped my shoulder and pointed toward the tablet showing our feeds. The decoy cameras froze one by one as the jammers swept over them. Our real line kept streaming. I whispered the time into the recorder and kept my voice even. The men reached the shed door, the padlock glinting once in the sun before falling into shadow. One tested the shackle, then nodded to the other. Rowan stepped forward enough to be seen by them through the gap in the fence boards. He didn't raise his voice, only told them this was documented and that their presence was unauthorized. One laughed, not with humor, but to cover the sound of the cutters closing on steel. The metal groaned, then held. From her roof position, Lena moved the drone closer, its gimbal tilting down to frame both men and the shed. The sunlight caught one man's face full, leaving no doubt who he was. The drone's feed broadcast to a private group chat of neighbors who had agreed to watch. Phones lit up across porches. The stillness of the block broke as curtains moved and screen doors clicked open. I pressed send on a pre-written message that dropped into the same group. Armed trespassers at my shed. Live feed linked. The first reply was a neighbor naming our street and calling out for others to step outside. The sound carried. The man with the jammer looked toward the street and muttered something sharp to his partner. The cutters dropped a fraction. Then a new noise cut through. The slow approach of sirens, distant but climbing. The men didn't run. They worked faster. Rowan lifted his phone and read a statement loud enough for the mic to catch. The words were clipped: date, time, location, nature of the offense, warning of police arrival. A porch light blinked in response from across the way, a signal we'd agreed on earlier in the day. 2 more lights followed, houses on both sides. The block had become its own witness. The lock on the shed shivered under another bite. Steel splinters fell into the grass. Rowan shifted his stance to keep both men in view, his plate carrier steady against his shoulders, helmet catching the low sun. One man cursed under his breath as the sirens tightened into our street. A patrol car nose appeared at the far corner, light bar already strobing. The cutters froze in air. The jammer's LEDs dimmed to nothing. Both men turned toward the sound of the cruiser, hands half raised as if caught between finishing the job and pretending they had just arrived. The officer stepped out before the car had even fully stopped, hand resting on the belt, eyes scanning from the shed to the men to Rowan. Another neighbor's phone was up, filming from across the fence. The air felt thick, the kind that arrives before a storm. Rowan spoke again, slow and exact, telling the officer these men had been instructed to remove cameras and force entry into the shed. The officer's pen moved as he asked for identification. From the corner of my vision, Lena's drone tilted up to catch the whole scene: the shed, the intruders, the patrol car, the open eyes of a street that had decided it would not be quiet tonight. The sun lingered on every surface, refusing to let shadows swallow the truth. The cutters hung open in the air, steel teeth paused an inch from closing. No one moved until the officer gave the first order. The officer's voice cut through the still air with measured authority. The 2 men set the bolt cutters on the grass, slow enough to show they understood the weight of the moment. The jammer followed, placed down like it might break if handled wrong. One officer stayed with them while another pulled up in a second cruiser, the tires crunching against the curb. Rowan stepped back just enough to let the law own the space. He kept his hands visible, phone still recording. I moved toward the shed to check the lock, noting the deep gouges in the shackle where the cutters had bitten. The steel held, but the message was clear. This wasn't about a mistake, this was intent. The officer asked who authorized them to be here. One of the men, Deke, kept his eyes low and said they had a standing contract with the HOA board to ensure compliance. He spoke like it was routine, as if cutting locks was just another box to check. The officer asked for the contract. Deke nodded toward his jacket pocket. Inside, a crumpled document slid free, stamped with a logo and a signature line bearing the title of HOA president. Karen's name. She arrived less than 5 minutes later, beige blazer sharp in the setting light, short white hair catching the last gold of the day. She walked fast but stopped just short of the cruiser, adjusting her expression into something calm. She claimed she didn't know the details of tonight's actions, only that routine security had been scheduled. The officer held up the contract. Her eyes flickered once before returning to stillness. Vic appeared behind her, sweat his collar. The officer asked if he recognized the contract. He said yes, but claimed it was meant for observation, not forced entry. Rowan spoke plainly. Observation doesn't involve disabling cameras or carrying bolt cutters. The officer nodded without breaking eye contact with Vic. Ephraim arrived from the other side of the street, carrying a folder that had never been more important. He opened it and handed over a stamped letter from the city attorney, dated only weeks ago, stating that no private enforcement was authorized to enter or interfere with personal property after hours. The officer read it twice, then slid it into an evidence bag alongside the contract. I watched the officer flip through the contract pages and pause on an invoice already marked paid. The date on the invoice was the day before tonight's events, and the description left little room for spin. Breach attempt, camera removal, shed entry. The officer read the description aloud for the body camera. Karen's hands stayed folded, but her nails pressed into her palm. One officer guided Deke toward the cruiser, flex cuffs replacing his free hands. The second man followed. Their jackets looked smaller now, stripped of the authority they had pretended to carry. The crowd along the street stayed silent, every neighbor holding their phone steady. Lena was still overhead with a drone, capturing the scene from above. 2 men in custody, the shed untouched, the board members standing in the last stretch of daylight. The officer turned to Karen and Vic, explaining that the investigation would expand to review every enforcement action under their leadership. He asked them to make themselves available for questioning at the station. Karen agreed with a thin smile. Vic just nodded, eyes down. The officer handed me a copy of the report number and confirmed that all evidence from tonight was logged and preserved. Rowan removed his helmet, his face calm but set. He thanked the officers for arriving before the lock gave way. The cutters still sat in the grass, teeth open, like a warning left behind. As the cruisers pulled away, the sun finally dipped low enough to stretch shadows across the yard. Karen stepped toward Vic, speaking in a low voice meant for no one else. But Lena's drone, still hovering, caught the shape of the words. She told him to take the fall. She told him she could make it go away if he kept her name out of it. We didn't need sound to know what had been said. Vic's shoulders dropped, his hands curling into fists before releasing. Karen turned away, her face a perfect mask again. The crowd began to thin, but the air stayed heavy. Rowan looked at me and said this was only the outer layer and that the real rot was still under the boards. The night agreed with him. The emergency HOA meeting filled the clubhouse before the clock struck the hour. Chairs scraped, phones lifted, and the air held a hum that wasn't conversation so much as expectation. Every seat faced the long table at the front where the board sat, flanked by a stack of documents and the weight of last week's nights. Karen sat in the center, beige blazer sharp under the fluorescent lights, short white hair perfectly in place, eyes moving slowly over the crowd like she was counting exits. Rowan and I stood along the sidewall, Ephraim just behind us with his worn folder under one arm. Vic sat 2 chairs away from Karen, his gaze fixed on the table. The rest of the board shuffled papers without speaking. When the gavel tapped, the room fell into the kind of quiet that hears every breath. Karen opened with a practiced tone, calling the recent events misunderstandings exaggerated by incomplete information. She said the HOA's mission was to maintain order and value for the community, that sometimes difficult measures were necessary, and that any intrusion was unintentional. A few heads nodded, more stayed still. Before she could pivot to the next topic, Deke's voice filled the room from a speakerphone placed on the table. He'd been called in remotely. His words landed heavy. The board president instructed him to create visible disturbances and apply door pressure to properties flagged for fines. He named the date and time of the order, the location of the meeting where it was given, and confirmed the payment for the shed operation came directly from the HOA account. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. The smell of coffee turned bitter. Karen didn't look at the phone. She looked at Vic instead, as though willing him to take her place in the line of fire. Vic's hands moved to his lap, then to the ledger he had brought. He cleared his throat and spoke to the room, voice uneven. He admitted the books had been altered, that certain invoices had been disguised as maintenance, and that he had stayed silent out of fear of losing his home, his position, and whatever peace he still had. He apologized to the residents directly, not with excuses, but with a tired acceptance of what he had done. Ephraim stepped forward, his folder opening to reveal the city's stamped letters and a list of violations that should never have been issued under current code. He held them up for the residents to see, each page a quiet indictment. Rowan added the note that private security contractors have no legal right to disable surveillance or enter property without consent, no matter what a contract says. The law, he reminded them, isn't subject to HOA convenience. The attorney we had retained, silent until now, rose from a back table. Her voice was measured and exact, outlining the potential charges: impersonation of officials, trespass, attempted burglary, fraud, and conspiracy. She spoke of restitution, audits, and the legal power residents have when their own association turns against them. Her words were not loud, but each one landed with the precision of a hammer. The board voted under the gaze of the entire neighborhood. When the motion to suspend Karen passed, it was by a wide margin and with no hesitation. She sat still, not touching the papers in front of her, eyes fixed on the tabletop. The gavel fell again, this time to mark a removal from operational authority pending investigation. Residents who had been silent for years began to speak. Stories spilled of late-night visits, unexplained fines, and threats left in voicemail. Phones recorded every word. The room, once divided by suspicion, found its voice in shared experience. I felt the shift, a neighborhood reclaiming itself inch by inch. But as the meeting closed and people filed out into the cooling evening, an envelope slid under my door at home. The postmark was from our own street. Inside was a lien notice for my property, signed with my father's forged initials. The paper still smelled of fresh ink. The timestamp on the bottom corner showed it had been printed during the meeting. I stood at my kitchen counter, the envelope flat under my hand, listening to the muffled sound of my neighbors outside. Rowan read the date, then looked at me with the same expression he'd worn at the shed, a quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't over. Somewhere between the vote and the walk home, the fight had found a new angle. The forged signature stared up from the page, daring me to stop. The morning after the forged lien arrived, the sky was sharp and clear, the kind of light that leaves no room for shadows to hide. I set my father's original fence permit beside the false document on the porch rail. One was yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but strong. The other was crisp, its signature heavy and wrong. Rowan stood beside me in quiet focus, Ephraim just behind, holding the folder that had become our anchor in this fight. We walked to the station with the documents in a sealed envelope. Rowan carried them like they were evidence from a battlefield, steady and deliberate. The clerk logged them in, assigned a case number, and handed me the receipt. It was more than paper. It was a promise that this trail would be followed. Karen appeared at the station entrance as we stepped outside, her blazer perfect, her short white hair unmoved by the wind. She asked if there was a way to make all of this go away, her voice low, as though the street shouldn't hear. She offered to remove the lien, to clear every fine I'd ever been given, if I agreed to drop the charges. Rowan didn't speak. I told her no, and the word felt like it belonged to every neighbor who had ever been pushed into silence. That afternoon, the city attorney filed motions that moved fast through the courthouse. A judge ordered an audit of every fine, fee, and lien issued under Karen's tenure. Investigators would interview residents, examine accounts, and trace payments. The HOA's authority was not suspended in theory. It was gutted in practice. The lock on their records room would open only under city supervision. Vic came forward fully, handing over ledgers, emails, and notes. He admitted to altering numbers at Karen's request, but he named every person involved and every date the scheme moved forward. He agreed to testify. Deke, faced with the choice of fighting charges alone or speaking, chose to plead. His statement matched Vic's and added details no one had seen coming, plans to expand the night operations to other neighborhoods under the guise of compliance services. Lena's drone footage became the heart of the case. The images of Karen accepting the envelope and key, of Deke at the shed with bolt cutters, of the arrests under the open sky, played on a loop in the news coverage. The street watched itself become the evidence. When the charges were announced, impersonation, trespass, attempted burglary, fraud, and conspiracy, Karen stood before the cameras without the blazer, her hair unstyled, her eyes sharp but ringed with fatigue. The bond was set high. Restitution was included in the conditions. The neighborhood she once controlled was now the witness against her. Weeks later, under a warm sunset, we held a block gathering. The old metal HOA signs came down one by one, replaced with hand-painted house numbers made by the residents themselves. Laughter carried over the lawns where suspicion had lived too long. Kids played under strings of lights. No one looked over their shoulder. On my porch, Rowan pinned his unit patch to the post, the threads frayed but strong. I hung my father's carpenter's level beside it, the bubbles centered, the line true. It was more than decoration. It was a statement that this street would stay balanced, no matter who tried to tilt it. Ephraim sat on the steps, telling a group of neighbors about permits and property rights, the kind of talk that sounds simple until you've seen it tested. Lena's drone hovered once over the party, catching the glow of the lights and the easy way people now moved. Justice wasn't just the charges or the fines returned. It was the silence at night, the sound of a street that no longer braced for knocks in the dark. The porch light stayed on, not as a warning, but as a welcome. If this story reached you, if you believe in standing your ground against those who misuse power, press like so more people can see it, comment midnight if you stayed with us until the end, and subscribe because there are still streets that need this kind of fight. We learned here that a community can be quiet until it decides not to be. And once it decides, no lock or seal can keep the truth out.